Now on to our next part of our program today. We have Chelsea here with us today from Beautiful Trouble to facilitate an anti-racism and organizing workshop. Beautiful Trouble is an international network of artists, activists, and trainers helping grassroots movements, like our own, become more creative and effective. As people dedicated to justice and peace, as we all are here today, it is critical that we not only focus on anti-racist advocacy work, but also look at how we can be more anti-racist and equitable internally, both within our organizations and as individuals. This workshop that Beautiful Trouble is about to present will center on discussion of practical organizing principles, theories, and strategies to use as a framework in the work that we do. And if you enjoy this workshop, Beautiful Trouble will also be doing a strategic campaign design workshop in breakout session 2. So you'll be able to hear from Chelsea more. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Chelsea.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Lizzie, Simona, Nick, all the names we've heard this morning, and so many others working behind the scenes to bring you this amazing two-day event. I'm so honored to be a part of this Sunday morning. I'm tuning in with you all from Los Angeles, California. So a few hours behind in the morning, I will be sipping on my coffee to make sure I'm energetically with you all. But really excited to be with you. Give me just a minute to pull up my screen. I practice this endlessly, so hopefully it's pretty seamless. Can you see just a set of slides on the screen? I'm getting thumbs up and head nods, so affirming, thank you. Well then without further ado, I'll go ahead and dive in. We have a very limited time to have a very robust discussion, and it's first thing in the morning. So I'm gonna do my best to walk us through this really slowly and thoughtfully. And I have a few things I'm going to do to make sure y'all can take some time to engage with me. So I may stop the screen share, drop a link in the chat for you all to engage with some things in person with me. So as it was said, my name is Chelsea Byers. I work with a collective of activists, artists, and organizers at Beautiful Trouble. We create resources, a great number of resources, many of which I'll share with you throughout the next 45 minutes. And we provide support and training to aid social movements around the globe. This morning, today, I will do what I can to contribute to what I hope is an ongoing discussion in your work as an activist around anti-racism and organizing. As an organization, Beautiful Trouble practices shared leadership, modified consensus-based decision-making, anti-oppression politics, and international and intersectional solidarity. Our work is in curating and disseminating resources, and we recognize the power dynamics inherent in language and any act of interpretation. And we especially acknowledge the historic plundering of indigenous and traditional sources of knowledge by those with more wealth, power, and privilege. As curators of the collective wisdom of diverse practices across many realms and regions, we respect the original sources of ideas and give credit where it's due. And still, our predominantly white, global north-based, cisgendered team is on an ever-evolving learning journey towards recognizing power and privilege and dismantling oppressive behaviors. So I want to share a few things about myself, sort of personally, to locate myself in this conversation and highlight some of the personal experiences I carry into this space. So I'm a white woman. I think that's clear. I'm from Arizona. While I live in California now, I'm from Arizona, where I grew up living just 5 minutes away from the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community and 2.5 hours from the border to Mexico, where my family would travel and camp on the beach at least 1 month my entire life. So I felt really close and proximate to what was otherwise really challenging land issues in my state of Arizona. I began my early work in progressive movement spaces and specifically in the anti-war movement. In fact, began working on campus as a student organizer, so really feel connected to this group of student activists here within the anti-war movement. And then I eventually found my way to organizing around ending sexual violence, really believing in that continuum of violence, whether it's the state or individual violence. My personal work is really in ending that violence. I was a co-founder of the Me Too March here in Los Angeles, and I chaired the campaign to end the statute of limitations on rape and sexual assault here in California. This is where my experience with anti-racism work really took off. I had an opportunity to attend Bill Cosby's trial in Pennsylvania. And this is where it became really imperative to my work in these spaces to understand and confront the history of white women leveraging their white femininity towards the state-sanctioned violence towards Black men in the lynching era. If I were to be a white woman discussing sexual violence, I needed to understand this part of the history, and I needed to understand how this lineage had rooted itself in me. Active anti-racist work became an essential ingredient to my own ongoing activism. And while I'm truly embarrassed to admit it took so long being an organizer in this space, I really do believe that it's a conversation that needs to be had more readily with the anti-war community, because it was my entry point and it took so long for me to have conversations like this actively. So I'm so appreciative and so grateful that you're having this conversation very actively here today. This deeper understanding and ongoing work has truly enriched the body of work I do as an organizer. Now, in a lot of the work I do here in Los Angeles around unhoused community members and the homelessness issue, I hold space for what I witness regularly as white women in Los Angeles leverage the $3.1 billion police budget and police resources to pushing unhoused community members off their block because they are fearful, right? That extension of fear enabled by white supremacy that is really fueled by fear of others, that commands our resources and disproportionately harms communities of color. Without a complex understanding of how institutions and individuals work together to uphold this racism, we here in Los Angeles would fail to fully confront this piece of the puzzle when it comes to our homelessness community. So just wanted to share a little bit about my personal journey interacting with the broader organizing and progressive movement space, and where anti-racism work has specifically confronted my ability to move forward, and where without this, I would truly be failing anything I seek to accomplish here. So I just wanted to share a little bit about that to connect myself to you all in this conversation. We know that anti-racism work is deep and extensive and must be done intentionally, because becoming anti-racist is not a static achievement. You don't get a trophy for doing this work. It is a lifelong commitment that we must make every single day. And we must remind ourselves and the people who share our mission that we're building an essential muscle, and this muscle will go stronger with time and effort. So we have to work out. We have to have these spaces. There's no shortcut to this work, and we can only get through it by moving forward. Anti-racism work has many elements, often beginning with a focus on individual bigotry and bias, which is so much of what we sort of enter into the anti-racism work, is confronting what's within us. Then sometimes it moves into a more historical, cultural, or structural, institutional analysis of racism and other oppressions. That piece of the work is incredibly important to do. Developing a shared historical analysis across your group, your organizing body, your organization is so essential towards the work for equity, because we have to have a specific shared definition of this institutional racism and as it shows up. That lack of a common analysis creates complications towards our goals. So you really need to be intentional about doing that. Unfortunately, we have 45 minutes in this space today, and there's only such a limited amount of the work that we can do. So I wanted to just sort of paint a picture of that spectrum that's there, of how much is really here and how committed we must be in an ongoing manner. And while we only have such limited time today, if we can all take a deep breath together, breathe in that commitment that we have towards making this work a part of our work ongoing, then I think we can spend the time that we have together this morning being very intentional towards this aim. So with that, I'm going to move us to the next slide. We have this fabulous quote from Alicia Garza: "The mission and purpose of organizing is to build power. Without power, we are unable to change conditions in our communities that hurt us. A movement is successful if it transforms the dynamics and relations of power." So we know that everyone here understands that community organizing is one of the core tools to rally mass momentum for social transformation. That's what we're doing here, right? We're trying to figure out how to community organize towards our goals. I, for one, believe that if we can create sustainable, resilient, and diverse communities and institutions that are accountable to communities of color, that we will repair our societies. But that means that we have to understand that white supremacy is at the root of our social ills. And we can't just stop there. If we understand that white supremacy is the root of our social ills, then we must work to center anti-racism in our work. We can't just make it secondary. And to do this, We have to understand how white supremacy became enshrined in and reproduced by our systems and institutions. White supremacy produces a culture of domination that conditions systems, institutions, and people, like each and every one of us here, to uphold and legitimize whiteness in its ways as normal, standard, moral, and universal. That way of us as individuals supporting and working to condition our organizations and enable and uphold this white supremacy within them is the piece of work that we're going to do together in just a moment. We know that disrupting white supremacy requires interventions on structural, cultural, and individual levels. And that most effective intervention is the work that we're talking about here today, this ongoing work of anti-racism. This is the strategic intervention that cultivates the ways of being and thinking that seek the dismantling of institutional and cultural practices that uphold white supremacy. So it's real, the way it shows up, the way white supremacy actually functions in our organizing, and the way it gets in the way of our ability to be anti-racist. And we'll talk about some of those things and what it looks like. There are many places or these points of intervention for it to occur. Again, we'll talk about some specifics. In the United States, our institutions and systems are the most major contributors and enablers to our oppressions. That's why we as organizers and activists wage campaigns against our institutions, right? We work to change and transform our systems. We're always thinking big, and we have those big strategic targets in mind. It's really admirable. These institutions and systems were created in partnership with the legitimization of white supremacy and dominance, which codifies that system of white supremacy and a worldview that enables and supports it. So this is why we can't just think about our systems and institutions as upholders and enablers of white supremacy. We have to root it out within ourselves too, because it's a two-way street, always working in support of each other. So this is why I want us to really get grounded in what it means to start rooting out racism within our work. It's the questions that I ask of, are groups ready to sign on to statements to support Black Lives Matter? Are you having conversations about those statements within your organization, right? Are you showing up at protests in solidarity of organizations doing this work? Or are you carving out staff days to have conversations about what bias and internal prejudices show up and maybe make it hard for you to hire more diverse staff? I see and have experienced the ways that groups are so ready to demonstrate their commitment to these goals as very external, but failed to embrace the obvious, although challenging ways that we have to do this work internally. So hopefully by the end of our conversation this morning, you'll have a little bit of a sense of some of the tools and ways that you can start thinking about this work more internally. This anti-racism or anti-racist transformation of our institutions and systems can begin through understanding how we as individuals participate in and are really integral to upholding white supremacy. And again, by providing those spaces for reflection, for individuals to interrupt behaviors that sustain white supremacy culture. If we don't provide that space for reflection, we're just going to keep going down these same patterns. And that's one of the biggest problems that we have as people of privilege, not recognizing that we have to stop and pause and reflect, right? So this means that the campaigns we run, no matter how ambitious the goals truly are around ending racism through those campaigns might be, we are ultimately hamstrung by our own individual capacity for this anti-racist organizing. So we must ask ourselves how much we as individuals enable and uphold those cultural practices that fuel white supremacy. And if you don't even have a sense of knowing what they are tangibly, then we have work to do, right? In doing this, we better cultivate the conditions necessary for those shifts within our institutions and organizations. And we start to do the hard work, as Alicia Garza talks about, of rearranging the dynamics of power, right? That's what this is all about. So again, it's really common and understandable and admirable that we hear all of this and we start asking ourselves or just pining for the answers of what do I do? And as participants in these spaces, I must urge us to hold that tension really dearly. We have to avoid rushing out to go do something. And instead, we have to hold that tension between our enthusiasm to be better and what is still truly a deeply limited understanding of all that is needed to know to put this into practice. So I'm asking you at once to take a leap of faith and prepare yourself to do it better. So this next slide, I'm going to show you some of the ways that you can start thinking about what it means to show up as an anti-racist organizer within the context of your group and organization. And as you start to think about ways that we can do this work better, let's consider the pieces of white supremacist culture that we may be upholding unintentionally or intentionally within our organizations, as this is what holds us back from evolving, right? So on the left side, you see a list of things that show up. And on the right, you see a list of suggestions for ways that we need to transform or evolve this thinking. This list of characteristics of white supremacy that show up in our organizations comes from the Center for Community Organizations, groups that did extensive consulting and studying with progressive organizations to start understanding what was holding them back from reaching their goals, right? The characteristics explored here are truly damaging. They're used as norms and standards without being proactively named or chosen by a group, right? These are things that we default to. Just by way of us being trapped in a culture of white supremacy in spite of how hard we may want to work against that. These are things that we default to. Because we all live in this white supremacy culture, these characteristics show up in the attitudes and behaviors of all of us. So these standards sort of unconsciously become the default, and that is truly damaging. If we produce a list like this, and let me say this list is not complete, right? There are probably many other things here that we could call attributes and pieces of white supremacist culture. But by producing a list like this, it allows us to question what type of organizational culture we are working within and what it is that we truly want to work within, right? And we can really work proactively and intentionally to build up a better, more inclusive culture for everyone, rather than defaulting to things that damage us. So let's walk through this list a little bit, and then I'm going to share a link because I want to see and hear from you all what might be showing up within your spaces. So a perfectionist culture. I wonder if anyone's ever thought of or confronted this idea of a perfectionist culture being a product of white supremacist culture. I know for myself, as someone who was raised deeply wanting to be perfect, to turn in all of my papers and documents 100%, unwiring and deprogramming myself from a culture that feared making mistakes and really motivated or used shame and guilt and fear as motivators was a deeply challenging thing to deprogram myself from. And it's still something I work from all the time. The biggest way I try to challenge this perfectionist culture is by not doing it to others. I feel and sense how deeply it is ingrained into myself. And when my brain starts to want to question somebody's, decision-making, or if I notice a mistake that somebody else has made, instead, I try to lean into what is here on this right side, a culture of appreciation, right? I think that's what the hindrance of a perfectionist culture really is that it keeps us from from understanding and seeing the ways that people have contributed, the ways that somebody's presence or ability has shown up in a space in a positive way. This also really keeps us from being in a learning environment, which again is so critical, that space for reflection and for understanding. The way that we challenge this perfectionist culture is by fostering an environment of learning from our mistakes, right? Another thing that shows up is this worship of the written word. I think if anybody has been a part of the development space or fundraising space, you really feel that, right? The exhaustion from grant reports and the overvaluing of the written word and the written skills. If you think instead about how we can accept many ways, many processes, many forms. I'm somebody who facilitates a small grant program for folks who are under-resourced around the globe wanting to put on direct actions. If the one mechanism that we had to accept reports was a 2-page, grant report template, we wouldn't hear back from some of our grantees at all. We've had to find ways to accept reporting from a WhatsApp voice note, right? How do we then take that voice note and send it on to our funders? These are really big questions, but understanding and thinking through those things means for us that that's how we are challenging the ways that white supremacist culture show up in our organization. Power hoarding, such an obvious example of it. I don't even need to go into depth, but I do want to say that if this year has showed us anything about how our health is so fragile, how our communities are so vulnerable, and what it means to actually work in solidarity and in support of one another towards our shared goals, then it means we must really work fiercely to support and cultivate leadership ideals that incorporate an understanding of the inevitability of change. And that's often painful for some of us to think about, but power hoarding is a product of white supremacy, and shared power is an antidote towards that. And we must lean into it. We know paternalism right? This way that we think that certain people know what's best or can make the best decisions for all others. Instead, we want transparency around decision making. We know that organizations that have a culture of defensiveness or sort of resistance to change and new ideas, that really comes from a place of fear. One good way that we can challenge that is by creating cultures of direct communication and practicing what it means to have direct communication, which could look like even role playing intense or challenging conversations that you might have in the workplace within your workplace, right? Make that type of space. A few other aspects, and then I want to hear from you all. We know that progress and success always, right? The rally has to be bigger than the last one. The action has to have more folks at it than it did before. We want more press hits. That type of more, bigger, better as an equation to progress or success is such a damaging aspect. It doesn't actually allow us to think about what is needed or what is effective or what will best measure our growth. And it truly ends up treating staff like casualties in pursuit of truly short-term goals. So the way that we challenge that within our organizations is to think in a bigger picture, right? We often think about our strategic plans in 3 or 5 years if we're doing our work really well. But what would the world look like if our organization's goals were accomplished over the next 25, 30, 50 years? Can we really challenge and stretch our imaginations to think beyond what is often just grant or funding cycles, right? Or election or electoral cycles? What can we do to get ourselves out of this framework of more, bigger, better? Because that is what is sort of eating us alive and not allowing us to really understand where our value and our impact are best felt. The last thing I wanted to share, and this one again, as I started with perfectionist culture being something that runs really deep in me, I know that the sense of urgency, especially in movement spaces, is something that I'm really trying to show up and question in a deep way as a product of white supremacy. This idea that we need to move so fast that we can't take the time to be inclusive, right? Instead of recognizing that these are the moments where we have to do the work to be inclusive. And if it means slowing down, then that's the call. This is often the thing that's reinforced by, again, funding cycles. We have too little money to do too much work. And so for some reason, our solution is to just move faster through it all because that's how we'll be able to get it all done. I really want to challenge that, especially because I know a lot of this was ingrained in me, in my work in the anti-war movement space. A movement whose roots go back for so many years. This is a multi-generational space of folks who started this work when they were young. And still this tendency to think that we can solve all the world's problems overnight is just deeply ingrained in us. I believe these things come or are encouraged because our desires to see a better world, our wishes and dreams for justice and for peace, and our desire to see that realized, and hopefully within our lifetimes. And still, I have to just put out there that this sense of urgency that we instill across our organizations, our groups, our actions, our events that we host is so damaging and is a product of that white supremacist culture. So the ways that we can be realistic, create practical work plans, do that type of thing for ourselves is all the more, that is the antidote to this type of behavior. So at this point, I'm going to drop a link to a shared slide deck. This slide deck has, I think about on slide 5, it begins and goes through slide 16. Now you can click this link and everybody should be able to open this up. And what I actually want to do is stop sharing that screen and start sharing a different screen for just a moment. Oh, good. It looks like folks are starting to hop in. This is fabulous. So if you're hopping in, I want you to scoot on over to slide 5. On slide 5, you'll see some squares here, some gray squares, and this carries on all the way through slide 16. Now, I would love for folks to start jumping in, using the text boxes, typing in here. Again, not everybody will do slide 5. Stretch yourselves out from slide 5 to 16, I believe it is. But find a space and please let me know of some of these elements that I've shared from this list. What are the ways that white supremacy culture has showed up in your organization? Maybe some of the things from that list have resonated with you. Maybe there's other instances, things that are more blatant. but I want to just share and solicit from this crowd. This is a space of trust, of vulnerability, and of honesty. And I think by doing this, again, we produce a way for us all to see and visualize what is there and is real and what we are all accountable to rooting out. I hope folks are able to share. Is it editable? I'm not seeing folks start to type in yet. Maybe we just need some brave folks to step up. So I'll repeat again. The link I shared is meant for folks to type into. Oh, good, now I'm seeing it. That shared screen feature wasn't letting me. So if you haven't already, starting from slides 5 all the way down to 16, there's some spaces. People can jump in, choose one of these gray boxes, and I'd love to hear from you. And again, this is sort of an anonymous opportunity to speak, but to hear from y'all some of the ways that white supremacy has showed up in your organization. And if you've already written, maybe you can just slide through and see the things that other folks are starting to type in here. I really appreciate you all taking a minute to write and respond. Not only is it helpful to sort of break up the endless drove of my voice just streaming at you, but to actually start thinking about this stuff in real ways, because this is real work that we all need to be committed to doing. So while you're doing that, there's some questions that I want us to also be thinking about. That list I provided again, it's a good list of characteristics of white supremacy culture that show up in our organizations. Things like that perfectionist culture, that worship of written word, or just the overemphasis of certain skill sets beyond others, right? Power hoarding, progress and success equaling bigger or more, a sense of urgency. But here's some questions I want us to think about as we're thinking about that list of characteristics. How do these cultural features exist in our organization, and how are they hurting us all? So how have you specifically been harmed maybe by a perfection or a culture of perfectionism, right? I shared some of the ways that it shows up in me and still sort of haunts me to this day. I think those antidotes, or thinking about the ways that we can intervene or interrupt this way of thinking in our mind, are really helpful. Maybe working backwards from that is helpful for us all too, right? Another question I want to ask is, what could we learn from the differences and how people of color in the group experience these cultural beliefs and how white folks do? So how each of us experiences these things might be different, right? Maybe a sense of urgency is something that serves you, right? That constant streaming, that constant pulsing, it really feeds your soul. It really nourishes you for some reason. It's okay to admit that these things may not feel like problematic to you. But I think this is where we have to really start being honest and work through empathy to understand how these differences show up and how they impact others, right? I just also really want to appreciate, I see a lot of folks writing into these gray boxes, and just really thank you so much. If you haven't had a chance, keep scrolling through those boxes and see what your peers in this room have written. I've got another question I want to just float out here. What steps could we take to change these features in a day-to-day way? What solutions could the antidotes offer? And are we willing to put those pieces to work? So I'm going to pull up my screen once more since I'm talking antidotes, right? We see what shows up and then the things that we need to try instead. What solutions could these antidotes offer? So if we're ready and willing to do that, I want to challenge us to start being humble about where we're starting from and commit to backing up our public statements with action, right? Some of what we're talking here today is a public statement. It's not necessarily action, right? We're here in this space. Feels like action, participating in a training, but I think we'll feel when the action's actually happening. It's going to start challenging us in new ways. Taking in this information is a privilege. Putting it to work is our task. If you've not already done this, now's the time to start adding anti-racism to your core values and find ways to operationalize these values by evaluating all of your policies in your organization and your decision-making processes through an anti-racist lens. So that's a huge scope of work that will take a long time to undertake. But I think this is a really good starting place. The work that the Center for Community Organizations have done is really fabulous. It's also important to establish clear goals tied to becoming an anti-racist workplace and attach success metrics to this journey so that it's actually real, right? And you must put resources towards this work. It can't just be something that's done in addition to or by chance. It has to be very intentional. So if folks are wrapping up their thoughts in those slides, please keep enjoying those slides, keep writing your thoughts there. I'm going to move us through a couple more resources I wanted to share with you all before I have to wrap up my talking this morning. I shared that I'm with a collective of activist organizers and artists, Beautiful Trouble, and that we have a number of resources that we share. We have a book, actually a number of books. I'm holding them up on my little video, which is very tiny. If you're using the shared screen feature, we have a card deck as well. An international network of artists, activists, trainers that help grassroots movements be more effective and creative. The work of Beautiful Trouble is really in supporting individuals, groups, and organizations through social change work. The secret to our success is our toolkit, which documents and disseminates the breakthroughs and innovations of cutting-edge practitioners all over the world. All of our work is multilingual, movement crowdsourced, and evolves in real time along the movements they serve. And we have them available in multiple ways. Obviously, I showed you the books, the card deck, and we have an online toolbox. So just to share a little bit more about the toolbox and its effectiveness before I leave you with some theories and principles to guide you through this work. Beautiful Trouble's effectiveness and utility come from that superpower of analysis. Again, if we do not spend enough time learning from our mistakes or learning from the things that we do ourselves, then we are damned to repeat the past. And the past is full of failures that we ought not to repeat. So let's take that time to analyze, to take with us the good and to learn from the bad and move forward with deep intention to effectiveness, right? So our toolbox is really built in that vein to leverage the superpower of analysis, of documentation and identification to share tools that are used in creative and strategic campaigns for freedom and justice around the globe. So the way that we do this, it's true, anyone can do this, right? We just work to identify the factors of success and break these things down so that others can understand them. We know that creative activism itself offers no one-size-fits-all solution, and neither do we. We're way less of a cookbook and more of a pattern language. So rather than dictating strict courses of action, we instead offer a really flexible matrix of ideas, interlinked concepts that you can pick and choose from and apply them in unique ways that may vary with each situation you face. So these tools help change makers analyze and learn from your own success and failures. And this toolbox is very humor oriented while dealing with very serious subjects. So we like to think of it as sort of one part prankster manifesto and one part direct action manual and one part training guide for mass organizing and collective liberation. And that's why I really thought it was important to share some of the words from the toolbox as I end this today. The toolbox itself contains hundreds of contributions from 170 plus frontline activists working on campaigns around the globe. Each entry is linked to related entries and creates a nexus of concepts that are infinitely expandable. The toolbox itself online serves as a hub where artists and activists from all around the world share ideas, converge and share stories, best practices, and this is why that number of entries in the book really continues to grow. So you see things organized into these different categories. It's been on the screen for a while, so I'm not going to read each to you. But again, to aid in this discussion around anti-racism and organizing, I just really wanted to uplift and share some of the words of wisdom contributed to this Beautiful Trouble toolbox. These principles and theories that I'll share, along with the hundreds of other modules on tactics, methodologies, stories, and then our debates as well, are available online for free and in 5 languages to support your ongoing anti-racist organizing work. So the first entry I wanted to just share is contributed by Harsha Walia, who's a South Asian activist and facilitator, writer, and legal researcher in Vancouver. The image that you see on the screen is a protest sign from a Tunisian demonstration in 2013. The entire toolbox is very fabulous in that you get such a scope of movement history as you search through the whole thing, just because of the so many different people who've written and photos and stories that are highlighted. to discuss what it means to challenge patriarchy as you organize, Harsha writes that since patriarchy pervades society, it's no surprise that it pervades social movements as well. I think we all understand that to some degree here. So a commitment to feminist praxis that challenges the toxic impact of patriarchy in organizing is essential to building inclusive movements. Given the urgency of confronting big issues like corporate power, militarization, and environmental destruction, patriarchy and sexism within our groups often remain unaddressed. That is so true of my experience, right? It feels like because we're trying to end the drone war, stop the war in Yemen, that I can't raise an issue about what's happening with somebody on the communications team, right? But it's all within the same space. And I think when I started to understand this principle of how to challenge patriarchy as I organize, it started to make me understand how important all this work was. And how, in fact, I wouldn't be able to stay a part of a campaign to end the drone wars if I couldn't stay safe in my own office space, right? So just to break it down like that, Harsha offers 5 key ways in which sexism manifests itself in social movements. I can spend a lot of time digging into this specific principle, but I wanted to just give you a little sense of what is there. And I'll move on to another. Very sad that this photo is not showing up right now, but this principle is solidarity, not aid. I also really like this. I was consulting with the organization United Way for some time and would use this in another way, solidarity, not charity, right? Thinking really about how we stand with somebody and don't just try to help them, but to support, to really be at the side of somebody. This entry was written by Mika Ben David, who is a community organizer of Palestinian and Israeli activists in Jerusalem. Mika writes that this heavy theorizing may all seem like, way too much to many activists. And indeed, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm not reading the right one. I'm so sorry, I made a mistake. We're gonna skip that. Maybe I'll be able to go back to it. See, this was an error in my slideshow. We almost made it through with no errors, everyone. I'm so sorry. We're gonna just have to move on to this next principle that I wanted to share by Joshua Kahn, who is an organizer and strategist serving movements for social justice and ecological balance. This image is by Tomas Carmelo. It's of Native people whose land and water were threatened by the Dakota Access Pipeline. These are the protests at Standing Rock, North Dakota in 2016. So Josh writes that accepting guidance from another isn't always easy for people who are already thinking of themselves as leaders. Self-identified leaders sometimes rush in too quickly, confident that they've got answers, while their preconceptions and prejudices blind them to the organic answers all around them. We can mitigate these blind spots by being intentional about respecting the process and cultivating accountability. But accountability can be a scary concept for activists. Don't we know that? But it's best to think of it as a proactive process that we can walk together rather than a standard that is achieved or not. So in this module, Josh reflects on the experience of another organization, the Ruckus Society, and their experience working with this principle. He talks about what it meant to be a North American-based network of direct action trainers and coordinators grappling with this dynamic of parachuting into other people's problems, other communities' problems. This is a dynamic I experienced often within the anti-war movement, right? What it means to sort of show up and want to support other organizations or other causes that are not necessarily our own. How do we do that well? So I think that this idea of follow the lead of the most impacted that Josh writes about is something that we can all learn from really well. As I mentioned, every single entry in the toolbox is sort of linked to another. So if you find something like this principle, follow the lead of most impacted, that's really moving or inspiring to you, you're able to keep finding other associated or sort of interlinked concepts and keep navigating yourself through there. So while there are hundreds of entries and it's very potentially easy to find yourself in the woods in a really deep, lots of options available to you of resources to follow, you can start with one and it'll keep telling you where to go to the next. Another way that the toolbox serves ongoing solidarity effort and has continued to support ongoing movements right now in the world is through the sets. So I was showing you individual entries in the toolbox. The screen that you see now has many different entries sort of listed below, but these are all organized in different sets that we've created. So we have a Palestine Solidarity, a new Pan-Africanism, and a Black Lives Matter set, as well as a few others. But I wanted to show you some of the specific ways that we've organized our toolbox to create an education or a resource available to you in solidarity of these ongoing movements. As I wind down, I believe I'm supposed to be finishing up now. I wanted to let everyone know how they can stay in touch. Beautiful Trouble's training and service delivery is extensive and broad. Again, we work in support of movements, working to help them be more creative and effective. And there's a lot that goes into all of that. You can find all of our work online, beautifultrouble.org. I hope you'll join our newsletter, follow us on social media, and then write this down, Trouble 10. If you were ever to grab something from our online store, that'll give you a discount for our shop. Sorry to make a little sales pitch, but I'd rather everybody get our resources at a little discount. So I didn't have a chance to peek into the chat throughout this. I'm so sorry if there were questions or comments dropped throughout. Maybe I'll have a chance to go back. And Lizzie, I'm so sorry if I'm ending this a few minutes early. She's saying I have 5 more minutes, so it's perfect. I wanted to just let folks know then that I'm at the end of my time, and if there's any questions, I would love to be able to answer them or point you in a direction of future resources. But thank you all so much. It's been really great to share the space with you. Oh, I've got a question about how to use the cards. We've done many trainings and workshops on how to use the cards. The cards, like the toolbox, contain individual entries, either stories, principles, tactics, or theories. You can see one of the cards here. It's much, a sentence or two about the entry that's on the specific card. So we've got a card on civil disobedience, the tactic, something that this movement knows very well. You can see a QR code on the screen that allows you to pull up the online toolbox entry from the card itself. We use these cards to help people design actions. I know we can all get sort of stuck into a box in our mind, but if you have a ton of different tactics written onto cards and you say, let's just flip over 2 and see what type of action we're going to pull off this week. It's a really great way to sort of get out of your mental box and into a different way of thinking. Similarly, we use these to analyze the work that we've already done. So if you run a campaign, if you held an event or an action, you could imagine looking at some of the principle cards, some of the things that I showed you on screen, and say, you know what, did we do this well? Did we choose our tactics wisely? Did we follow the aspects of this principle to a degree that would have given us or guaranteed us greater success in this action, or could we have done more? So we like to use these in both the planning sense and also that analysis sense. It's also really fun to do sort of a history game with it, a flashcards, or what's it called? Cards Against Humanity. We have a Cards for Humanity game that you can do with this. The last thing that we have that we do with it typically is sort of a divine the future. You can flip over a certain set of cards, have somebody pick one, and then for some reason, it always just ends up being the perfect thing that you want to read for that day, sort of like a tarot reading. I see somebody here asked, what has been the greatest challenges your organization has gone through from idea to its present form? How do these challenges enhance what you do now and grow at Beautiful Trouble? That is such a fabulous question. And to be really frank with you, I'm going to drop a blog post that we wrote about this exact thing. The question about what has been the biggest challenge that we have encountered and how have we overcome it, it is such a learning for us that we wanted to write down the story. And so we did. And I'm just stalling to continue to say this so I can pull it up, but I'm going to drop it into this chat thread because it's a really fabulous story. It's a really vulnerable story of ours that we want to share because it was a way that we became better in a really hard moment. So I'll share that and see if there's any other questions here. If there's anything else folks want to drop out, please do. I know I have 2 more minutes and I'm still trying to find that blog post.
Folks can also raise their hands if they'd like to ask a question. If you're on a phone, I know there's some shortcut to raise your hand. Does anyone remember what that is? I feel like it's *9.
I just found the blog post, and it's actually a two-parter because that's how serious this lesson was for us. It occurred at our very first ever training of trainers gathering, where we were attempting to launch our first network of trainers to do this work really well. And you'll read the story, and it's really fabulous. And again, as I mentioned in the piece by Joshua Kahn, there's many stories in the toolbox of failure. And we really appreciate the organizations who share these stories with us. It takes a lot of vulnerability to fail and to keep working. Fail forward is one of our principles. And again, I think if that's the biggest takeaway I can have is creating more space for this type of learning, right? And analysis, to slow ourselves down, to be more reflective, and to better understand where we're coming from so we can go somewhere else. So maybe if we have one more minute, I will try to divine our future here on the call. Some of the cards don't totally work for this, and there's nothing worse than saying that we're going to have a really cool reading of the rest of our day, and then you get a card that just doesn't make any sense and sits with you wrong. If you're somebody who does tarot readings, you know what that's like anyways, so we'll try to avoid it at all costs for this group. If I can get a brave participant who wants to watch the screen as I am holding up the cards and pointing down to a specific one, I can hear you say stop, and I will. And then I will read that card that is up there for everyone. So let me get a good spread, and let's see who wants to say stop, and I will.
Stop.
Oh, I heard it. All right, I got it. Oh, I love this. Okay, we got simple rules have grand results. And what a great lesson to be left with at the end of an anti-racism and organizing workshop that can feel so overwhelming and leave us with so much to do. Simple rules can have grand results, right? So the card says, rather than trying to script everything out, often a few simple rules say, come to Wall Street and bring a tent, or bang your pots and pans at noon. Those simple rules can be enough to spark a surprisingly effective mass action. So with that, if we could think about how we would apply simple rules can have grand results to the end of a conversation about anti-racism and organizing, maybe by having one conversation with our team a week about this topic, or carving out intentional space in an ongoing way, we can start to see grand effects happen across our organizations and therefore our movements. I really thank you so much for the time with you all. Now I've officially gone over 1 minute. It's been really fabulous to be with you, and I'm really grateful. Thank you so much.